Hello, we're going to start out by reviewing some of what we've been doing with obstruent voicing contrast and neutralization as a way of sort of transitioning us into our next unit on morphological or morphophonological alternations. And so I'm going to start out by reviewing, this is stuff we've all already covered in this class. So we've been talking several times in the class about the perception of different kinds of contrasts and how they depend on phonetic cues. And so in particular, we've been focused on voicing in here for the last couple weeks. We saw that the perception of laryngeal contrasts, like plus or minus voice, depends on certain phonetic cues, and those cues can differ by context. So in particular, we decided that voice onset time was going to be a pretty important perceptual cue to voicing contrasts, and this is the lag between the release of a stop and the onset of periodic voicing in the following sound, right? So if it's a long lag or positive VOT, means that the vocal folds are spread, and that's going to be an aspirated stop. If it's near simultaneous burst and voicing, that means that the vocal folds are going to come back together after the stop is released, or right as the stop is released. That's going to be a roughly zero VOT, and that's going to be voiceless and unaspirated. And if you have voicing going before the stop is released, that is during the stop closure, and it never stops the voicing, then you're going to have negative VOT, and that's going to be a fully voiced or pre-voiced stop. So that's basically one of the main cues that you could use as a listener to figure out whether the sound that you're hearing is plus or minus voice, plus or minus spread glottis, right? So way back in September, when we looked at this paper by Fujimura et al., and that one was about place contrast, but the perceptual facts about context sensitivity are going to be basically the same for both voicing and place. What we saw there is that it looks like voicing for stops is perceived in ways that depend on the surrounding context, and we can outline a hierarchy of different contexts where we think voicing contrast should be clearer or less clear based on your ability to perceive these cues. The clearest distinction should be before a vowel, and that's because in order to hear the lag between the release of a stop and the onset of voicing in a following sound, it helps when the following sound has strong voicing in a strong periodic component and formant transitions, as vowels do. The next clearest context should be before some other voiced sound with internal formant structure and strong voicing. That would basically be the sonorant consonants, approximants, and maybe to some extent nasals. And then the next clearest after that should be after a vowel, but not before one. And there you would have the cues of whether there's actually phonetic voicing occurring or continuing before the stop burst, as well as the duration of the preceding vowel, which will tend to be shorter before a voiceless stop. And what we said back in September was that if these facts matter in phonology, using our deductive reasoning here now, going from very general principles about phonetics and speech perception, trying to predict specific things from those general principles, we'd expect that sounds contrasting for laryngeal properties would be less likely to appear in the less clear contexts. And that should be true in every language. If these perceptual facts that we saw in the Fujimura paper are not just specific to Japanese and English, then we would expect this to extend to all languages. How might that look? Well, the sounds in question might just not be allowed at all in unclear contexts, or we could imagine that the contrast might be neutralized in those less clear contexts. And so this ties in to what we were looking at in the last lecture. And I've put in this typological table at the beginning of section 2 here. This has a number of languages that we looked at last week, as well as one additional one, which is Muniche. And I put this in here for the sake of completeness. We'll talk about it briefly later, but we're actually not going to get the constraints that we need to analyze Muniche this semester. It gets into some more complicated territory. I did want to put it here to show that this is really the complete typology that we know of for voicing contrast with regard to these specific contexts. So what did we see here? Well, in this table, the first thing to notice is that wherever a contrast is allowed, I put a check mark. Wherever it's not allowed, I put an asterisk. And the table is asymmetrical. So if you have a check mark in any box here as a particular language, you will have check marks in all of the boxes to its left. And if you have an asterisk in any box here in a particular language, you will also have asterisks in all boxes to its right. So what does that mean? Well, basically, we've ordered these contexts from left to right as before a vowel, before a sonorant, consonant. At the end of a word, that should be following a vowel at the end of a word, and following a vowel before an obstruent. And what we can see here is that basically those have been ordered from the best to the worst cue availability, right? Where the easiest context to perceive voicing contrast is on the left, and they get worse and worse as you go to the right. So another way of describing the patterns that we see in this table is that if you allow voicing contrasts in some difficult to perceive context on the right, then you'll also allow it in all easier to perceive contexts. And if you disallow voicing contrasts in some easy context on the left, you'll also disallow it in all more difficult to perceive contexts headed to the right. That's basically what we're seeing in this table, and that matches up with the deductive reasoning that we did earlier. So the final question here is, well, what kind of constraints are we going to need to analyze this pattern? And I wanted to go through this in a little bit of detail because it's going to work a little bit different than the anteriority example that we saw earlier when we started doing optimality theory. There we had 3 different kinds of constraints, and we got 4 different patterns out of rearranging them. In this pattern, for this feature or these contrasts, we'll see that there's at least with the constraints we'll use in here, there is no allophonic pattern, and that's because the relationship between the constraints is a little bit different. Here's the overarching question. In order to deal with the languages in this table, except for Muniche, you can ignore that for now, what kinds of constraints are we going to need? And let's start with the sort of easier cases, which is just prevocalic versus end of a word not prevocalic. Right? So in order to figure out what kinds of constraints we're going to need, again, let's start with the assumption that we're going to need one general markedness constraint, at least one context-sensitive markedness constraint, and one faithfulness constraint. Right? So what kinds of specific constraints would we need? Well, here's our inductive reasoning again. So starting first, consider these facts and ask what kind of constraints you'd need to deal with it. So Maori, as well as many other languages that we haven't really looked at in here, but it's very common, bans all voiced obstruents across the board in any context. So what kind of a constraint would you need to do that? Well, here's one. It's going to be a general markedness constraint that says, straightforwardly enough, don't have voiced obstruents, where minus sonorant here is going to be the specification for obstruents in our feature theory. And so this is going to be the context-free constraint, or the general markedness constraint, don't have any voiced obstruents. And this is active in many, many languages. Right? So there's a general or context-free markedness constraint. English allows contrast in all the contexts considered here, at least, with respect to the prevocalic and end of a word context. That's all I'm talking about here. So we learn nothing really about markedness from the English case. German and Thai, as we saw, neutralize voicing contrasts word finally. And interestingly, they both do so in the same way. That is, both of them seem to neutralize to voiceless unaspirated in word final position. So how might we deal with that using a markedness constraint? Well, it's going to be roughly the same as with the anteriority case. What's being banned in word final position? Well, in both languages, we're missing these exact same segments, the voiced obstruents, plus voice minus sonorant, but specifically in word final position. Right? So that's what this pound sign means. So this is going to be the context-sensitive markedness constraint. In Thai, you would need another one that says star plus spread glottis in word final position. We won't deal with that right this second, but it's going to look more or less exactly the same as this analysis, just with one different feature in here. Yeah, and so one thing to notice here is that this is a little bit different from the anteriority case, because in the anteriority case, the general markedness constraint, the inventory constraints that we saw cross-linguistically seem to be against one feature value, namely the minus anterior fricative esh, whereas the context-specific one for anteriority was against the opposite value of that feature, namely the anterior fricative se, in a particular context. When we had those opposite features in the general markedness and context-specific markedness constraints, it allowed us to derive an allophonic neutralization pattern. Here, it's voiced obstruents that are being banned in both positions, so there is no way to get allophony out of these constraints. So that's going to be one fewer kind of language. And then, of course, the last constraint we'll need here is faithfulness, and what's being protected or what's being changed in the cases we're looking at, mostly voicing. And so the third constraint we're going to need here is ident or faithfulness to the voicing feature. Right? So that's going to penalize changing the underlying representation of a specific morpheme with regard to the feature plus or minus voice. Right? So just like the other case of factorial typology that we looked at with anteriority, we're going to have the exact same ranking recipes, as I've called them, to derive different distributions. But here we're not going to be able to derive an allophonic pattern, which is fine because we don't actually see an allophonic pattern in this typological table that we made by observing languages. Now, to be clear, there are some languages out there that have allophonic variation in voicing. It involves a bunch of contexts and constraints that are completely separate from the ones here that we're not going to deal with this semester. But with just these three constraints, we can derive several patterns. And I'm not going to go through all the details of each tableau here. If you're wanting to understand the details of how this works, I think it will be better for you to do that yourself. But let me go through broadly how the ranking recipes work. And as we talked about in the last unit, when you have faithfulness high ranked, it means that preserving the feature values in underlying representations is going to be the most important goal in a grammar. And therefore, you're going to end up with contrast everywhere. Right? So if you have faithfulness high ranked, above the markedness constraints, whatever order these two constraints end up being in, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to write markedness here. Am I going off the camera? Not quite. Okay. That says markedness. So no matter what the ordering of the two markedness constraints is, as long as faithfulness is high ranked, you're going to allow contrast to surface everywhere, at least with regard to these contexts. That's the English pattern. And with regard to word endings and word beginnings, that's also the Khasi pattern. What about if you have context-specific markedness high-ranked and faithfulness in the middle and general markedness low-ranked? Well, that's the ranking recipe. So I'm going to try to make myself some more room here. Actually, let me just abbreviate these. That will make this easier. This is going to be general markedness. This will be context-specific markedness. And this will be faithfulness. Right? So faithfulness over general markedness and context-specific markedness, whichever order these two are in, that gives you contrast everywhere. That's the English and Khasi cases here. If you get instead the recipe for positional neutralization, which if you go back and look, that recipe has the context-specific constraint high-ranked, and then faithfulness in the middle, and then general markedness low ranked, this is going to get you positional neutralization. Here, in general, if you're not in the specific context, which is the end of the word in this constraint, elsewhere, faithfulness is more important than not having voiced obstruents, right? So you're not going to devoice an obstruent in this language in the general case. Instead, voicing contrast will surface faithfully, except in this specific context where avoiding voiced obstruents becomes the most important goal in this grammar. Therefore, you're going to neutralize this contrast to minus voice at the end of a word, but otherwise allow the contrast in elsewhere. This is the positional neutralization pattern that we see in German and Thai. And incidentally, it looks like in Muniche, although we'll get to that later. And then the last possibility here would be that general markedness is ranked above faithfulness. And here, it doesn't matter where you rank context-specific markedness. It can be up here, it can be down here. It doesn't matter what you do with that context-specific constraint, because if the general constraint that says don't have any voiced obstruents is a more important goal in your grammar than preserving the underlying representation of the voicing feature from the lexicon, then no matter what context you're in, and no matter what this context-specific markedness constraint says, you're always going to change all voiced obstruents to be voiceless in order to satisfy this most important priority in your grammar. So this is going to be a language with inventory constraints against voiced obstruents, as we saw in Maori, and this is also very common in many other languages in the world, to not have any voiced obstruents at all. This actually covers all of the possible ranking permutations. Right? So this is two different rankings up here. This is a third ranking. And then depending on where you put the context specific markedness constraint, you can get any of three rankings for this one. So high ranked, middle ranked, or low ranked, doesn't matter. You get the same language from each grammar. So that's 3 plus 1 plus 2. That's 6 rankings. That's all the rankings you can make with these three constraints. So the factorial typology, with respect to prevocalic position and word final position at least, there's only 3 possible languages predicted by these constraints. Each of them is attested in this table. And this is another case of factorial typology. It's a little bit different than the anteriority one because we don't predict any allophonic pattern given these specific constraints. Right? But yeah, this is basically what we predict. We have an example of each of these languages. And more generally, this typological table does seem to be obeying what we inferred deductively from our general principles of phonetics and speech perception, that the following context is really important for voicing contrasts, and that languages seem to care about this in some way. That basically voicing contrasts are more likely to neutralize in contexts where they're harder to hear. Now, there is another set of contexts here. We looked at what this is like before different consonants. And what we're seeing here is that in general, several of these languages allow contrast before sonorant consonants, like Khasi, English, and German, but don't allow those contrasts before obstruent consonants. So Khasi is the only one here that does allow voicing contrasts before an obstruent. English and German neutralize the contrast in that context. So we're going to need at least one more context-specific markedness constraint. What would that look like? What kind of a constraint would you need to deal with German and English? Well, this is where things get a little bit complicated, because what we saw in both German and in English is not that you only get voiceless obstruents before another obstruent. It's that whenever you have an obstruent preceding another obstruent, it matches that second obstruent in voicing. In other words, this is an assimilation process. Right? In English, for instance, we can get words like, acting or captain, and then marginally we can have words with two voiced stops in there, like I'm trying to think, Ogden or things like that. But what we never get is a mismatching voiced plus voiceless or voiceless plus voiced stop cluster in the middle of an English word following a stressed vowel. Doesn't happen, right? So it's always assimilatory there. And this is going to be a different kind of positional neutralization, right? Because it's not neutralization in some context getting rid of a specific feature value. This is assimilatory neutralization, where the sound in question takes on the feature value of whatever follows it. And in order to do that, we're going to need a different kind of constraint. So one possibility here, using the same kind of framework that we've been using in this class, would be to just write two separate constraints. How would we do that? Well, what don't English and German allow? They don't allow a combination of a voiceless obstruent followed by a voiced one. And they don't allow a combination of a voiced obstruent followed by a voiceless one. So that is certainly one possibility. You just have two context-specific markedness constraints. It looks like these are pretty much always ranked in the same position in many languages, or possibly all languages, which makes this a kind of funny solution. If these are separate constraints, they should be freely re-rankable within the OT framework, and they should make different languages if they're ranked in different places. Instead, we usually see that languages combine both of these assimilatory processes, and so there's a kind of shortcut for doing this kind of assimilatory process. This is going to be relevant in one of your later homeworks. And that shortcut is a kind of constraint that is often referred to as an agreement constraint. And we can write this agree. And this is an assimilation constraint, and it says that two segments with these features have to agree for this other feature. So in particular, for this case, what we're finding in English and German is that obstruents that are next to each other must agree for voicing. So how are we going to write that? First, we pick the structural description of the sounds that undergo the agreement process. So here it's obstruents. So we're going to put a feature value. And then the second part of this is not going to be a feature value. It's going to be a feature, right, that they must agree in, whether it's plus or minus. I'm sorry, let me make sure I'm not going off the board here. No, I'm good. Okay. So they're agreeing in the voicing feature regardless of its value. So the first argument of this constraint has a feature value minus, right? But the second argument is just the name of a feature that has to agree whether it's plus or minus. So this is basically a shortcut way of stating these two constraints together, right? So if two things match in minus sonorant, right, then they can't mismatch in the voicing feature. Right? So this will get us assimilatory voicing neutralization if it's ranked above faithfulness to voicing. Right? This is essentially a context-specific markedness constraint. If you sub it in for this one that we looked at the end of a word, you'll get exactly the same typology as we got with regard to word final voicing. There we saw we got contrast everywhere, English and Khasi, contrast nowhere in Maori, positional neutralization in this context in German and Thai. Same thing with this agreement constraint. We're going to get, depending on how we rank this with regard to faithfulness and general markedness, we're going to get voicing contrasts everywhere, as in just Khasi in this case. We're going to get voicing contrast nowhere, as in wow, Maori, right? And we're going to get a positional neutralization pattern if we rank this above faithfulness with general markedness ranked below it. We're going to get positional neutralization before an obstruent to whatever the voicing value of that following obstruent is. That's roughly the pattern that we see in English and German. Right? If you combine these two scales or these two sets of constraints, you end up with more than 3 languages. Namely, you end up with 4 languages. There's 2 different positional neutralization patterns, each one corresponding to one of these context-specific markedness constraints. And we still haven't done Muniche. You need different kinds of constraints to do Muniche. I did want to include it here just because it is an important part of this voicing typology. So let me briefly talk about this Muniche data. What we're seeing here in Muniche is that words can start with 2 consonants. It looks like it has, in general, voiced and voiceless stops. And these certainly both appear before vowels. They both appear in between vowels, and so on and so forth, voiced and voiceless. When you look at the beginnings of words here, you sometimes get sequences of 2 consonants, where the second one can be either voiced or voiceless, either obstruent or sonorant. But in those words with 2 consonants, as in the toad species, tra, the pineapple, tpr, the horsefly, ta, the cramp, stachna, the house, chna, a species of palm tree, snin, a cicada, kinini, a heron, snuku, or a fart, tb. No matter what that second consonant is, whether it's a sonorant or an obstruent, voiced or voiceless, what you find here is that the first consonant, the first obstruent there, is always voiceless. So it only allows voiceless stops and fricatives before another consonant, regardless of whether that consonant is an obstruent or a sonorant. Right? So we're going to need, you can probably see, we're going to need some different kinds of constraints to deal with this, and in particular, because it looks like this positional neutralization in Muniche is not assimilatory the way that English and German were, we're going to need a totally different kind of constraint to deal with that. We might get to that late this semester or next semester, but it's not going to be part of the typology that we're doing right now.